Okay, go live.
Okay. Croeso I gyd. Dwi hapus. Welcome to the Labour for Indie Wales launch event. If you are interested in joining us and you haven't yet and you're a member of the Labour Party, you can check us out at our website at lab4indie.wales. That's LAB 4 Wales Indie, sorry, LAB 4 Indie.Wales. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. We have Lloyd Williams, Madhu Khanna-Davies, Rory Scothorne, Sam Pritchard, and I'm Rachel Garrick, and I have no authority here. I will be trying to chair ourselves quite badly. So, without further ado, let's go to our panelists. Hugh, I'd like to bring you in first. Could you tell us about your interest in Welsh independence and your journey towards that?
Rachel. Yeah, so I was one of the two founders of Labour for Independent Wales, along with Ben Gwalchmai back in 2017. And yeah, it's fair to say my interest in politics stretches back way longer than that. Brought up in a socialist Labour family, actually not in one of the traditional perhaps strongholds, but in North Ceredigion, close to Aberystwyth. And yeah, in that part of the world, obviously, with Plaid Cymru having a strong presence, the idea of independence was never something that was seen as strange or niche. It was very much part of the political discussion and culture, and I suppose that would have had some sort of influence on me in terms of always being open and understanding the arguments. I think really it was obviously the events in Scotland that really was the big change. In particular, perhaps seeing that the Labour Party, or Labour Party members rather, were very much part of the debate and the referendum campaign up there. I think my interest probably went back a little earlier than that. Frustrations and views on the Labour Party perhaps, and understanding by the end of the first decade of the millennium that politics wasn't perhaps destined to go the way that I would hope. And yeah, a couple of things as well in terms of my own personal experiences that shifted the tectonic plates, if you like. One of the great experiences I had as a younger man was helping Alastair Morgan with his memoirs. So he's a former Labour Party member of Parliament for Ceredigion from 1966 to 1974. Some of you may know that he was a Plaid Cymru member before that. And it was just really, really interesting talking to him about his views, the way in which he, as it were, stuck by his values and his ideas when he went into the Labour Party. And although it wasn't comfortable for him, he still extolled the virtues of the idea of an independent Wales. And that really sort of brought it home to me that, the two aren't mutually exclusive, and they haven't been mutually exclusive either. There was an element of learning about the history and tradition of the Labour Party in Wales. In its inception at the turn of the 19th century, there were a lot of key figures who were very much in favour of the idea of independence. It's always been there, part of our tradition, even though perhaps it's ebbed and flowed. So yeah, I think that more or less sums up the background from my point of view. And just wanting more than anything, I suppose, when I started this with Ben, to have the conversation and to get over that idea that, Wales is too small, too poor, and so forth. So yeah, that's me.
It does sound like a similar journey to one I recognise, although without the guidance of a former Labour MP. Madhu, how about yourself? Do you want to introduce yourself, where you come from in the Labour Party, and what your opinion is and what your journey has been on the independence scene?
Okay, so firstly, thank you for inviting me onto this panel. My name is Madhu, I live in Cardiff. I originally come from Bridgend. I am a socialist and a Labour Party member. And so I will just talk you through my journey of why I support Welsh independence. And my support for Welsh independence is both a personal one and a political one. Indeed, one informs the other. And I came to this position, I would say, it's almost like an organic process, the seeds of which were sown in my childhood. And that sense of identity and that political position has been watered throughout my life. And with regard to independence, I would say that it is now in bloom. The time is ripe. So for me, an independent Wales has been a long-held dream. I would always tell myself, one day, as my father would tell himself, one day. You know, it was something far away. It was a dream. And you know, we've gone through a lot of hardship in Wales. I've lived through a lot of hardship throughout my life. It's not been an easy journey, okay? And the last 10 years, we have really been battered, our communities, by austerity. And I was pulled into the Labour Party through fighting against austerity. And it's one thing after another. But there was a trigger moment for me with regard to supporting Welsh independence. And that particular trigger moment was the Westminster government's refusal to fund the Swansea Bay tidal lagoon in 2018. I was devastated. I had so much hope, you know, for that. It was like a beacon of hope. It was something for the future, it was something positive. And I was just astounded that it was not going to happen. And I felt that it was not only a vote of no interest in Wales, that it was just yet another instance of Westminster holding Wales back from us achieving our potential. And I felt that at that moment, enough was enough. That Wales needed to break free of the neo-feudal, elitist, aggressively capitalist UK state that fails us time and time and time again. I felt that only a truly radical solution could bring us the change that we needed. We need structural change. And we need that to address the economic and social injustices in our society. And for me, that change is independence. I believe another Wales is possible. A Wales that is egalitarian, that is peaceful, that is wealthy, that is internationalist in its outlook. And I believe that we owe it to our future generations to work now to bring that Wales into realisation. We need to do that through independence.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to bring in Rory at this point. Rory, you've joined us from Scotland with experience of the Yes movement in Scotland. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your views on it and experience in independence?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rachel, and thanks everyone for having me on. I'm really pleased that there is a Welsh Labour for Independence. I am obviously based in Edinburgh. I'm a freelance writer and a PhD student. I'm studying Scottish nationalism and the left. And I got into the independence movement when I was about 16. I joined the SNP, and I was in the SNP for quite a few years. I got really active in about 2011 when the SNP won that breakthrough majority in the Scottish Parliament that led to an independence referendum, and I was quite active in elements of the referendum campaign. So I was involved with setting up National Collective, which was a pro-independence cultural campaign. And then I was involved with a kind of writing collective called Rock Winds, who kind of approached the question of independence from a socialist perspective and a labour movement perspective. So a big part of what we were trying to do was articulate a class-based and labour movement-based engagement with the question of independence that was critical of the SNP's vision of independence, which is a fairly standard bourgeois democratic approach to the question. And we were much more interested in exploring the kind of more radical potential of the independence movement. That involved me joining the Labour Party for some reason, just as everyone else in Scotland was going in the other direction. And since then, I've been obviously involved with campaigns around Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And I went kind of agnostic on the question of independence while Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, partly because, you know, the SNP has been in power here for quite a long time now, and they haven't brought us that much closer to anything resembling social democracy, never mind socialism. And so that long process of disillusionment with the SNP also underpinned a kind of agnosticism about independence. But 2019 kind of shunted me back into the pro-independence camp. And since then, myself and various other comrades in Scotland have been trying to argue for the Scottish Labour Party to have a much more open-minded approach to the question. One that at the very least recognises the right of the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum on independence, something that the party is now currently opposed to, and also trying to shape the way that the Labour movement is thinking about the question. And I hope we can talk a bit more about the kind of Scottish lessons, or some possible Scottish lessons for Wales from all of those developments. But I really also want to hear what the terms of the debate are in Wales, what people are thinking, and then maybe we can think about what lessons there might be from the Scottish situation, which is different in some ways and also remarkably similar in others. So again, thank you so much for having me on.
Chair, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you very much. So Sam, can you tell us about which part of the Labour Party you're from and where you've come from in Labour and what your journey has been to the reaching the conclusion that independence for Wales is the route that we need?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. My name is Sam Pritchard, and I am the Secretary of Labour for an Independent Wales, and I live in Swansea, and so I can relate to the anger felt at blocking things like the Tidal Bay Lagoon. But for me, what I really want to focus on is how I am very much through and through a Labour Party member. I've done all that boring things that seems to take up far too much of my time, as my wife thinks. I'm a county councillor, I'm a CLP chair, I'm a branch secretary. I've been a member of the Labour Party since I was 18, campaigning in every election in wind and rain, sticking through leaflets, through letterboxes with angry dogs in. Wherever the election is, I'm there championing for the Labour Party. And previously I've served on the Young Labour National Committee, and I've sat as a member of Labour's National Policy Forum. And the reason why I stress all of this is because I want people to understand how committed I am to our party, how much I love our party, how much our party is the only alternative to cruel cuts and austerity posed by the Tories. And so my views on Welsh independence do not detract from my view that the Labour Party is the only alternative. The Labour Party is the only party of the working class. The Labour Party is the only party of trade unionism. The Labour Party is the sister party to the Co-Operative Party. Also, I'm a member of a very proud Co-Operative, where we work together, we are stronger. Where we come together and unite, and where we see our strengths collectively, we are so much more powerful. And so I'm firmly a trade unionist. I believe the only good unionist is a trade unionist. That's my view. But for me, I see that Welsh independence is the best way to practice and implement our shared collective values. And that's why I'm fully supportive of Welsh independence, because Wales has never voted Tory. And yet we are burdened by Tory government after Tory government when we don't vote for them. We've got more sense in Wales. We don't vote Tory, and yet for most of my life, we've had Tory governments. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's democratic. Most of my life has been spent under cuts. Tories who do not represent Wales, Tories who make the problems in Wales worse. Tories who, a Westminster government that presides over child poverty massively increasing. a Westminster government that seemingly is callous, cold, and doesn't care. So for me, it makes perfect sense that we would want to seek an opportunity to break away from this Conservative Party and to forge a new way with our Labour Party values. For the Labour Party in Wales has done amazing things. And I believe that the Labour Party in Wales could do so much more if we had more power, more autonomy. And I think the best way to achieve that autonomous Labour government is for Welsh independence. So we can finally be free from these cruel policies implemented by Westminster.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so for our first question that I'd like to debate, I'd like to go back to you, Madhu. It's been a long journey for Wales and for Labour. We've seen that Cllr Edgewater now seems to be turning a tide. People are speaking more and more about independence. We're seeing the younger generation looking more towards it. But even polls out as recently as today show that there's still some of us who are not yet of that mind. So for those of us who are starting to ebb with Cllr Edgewater and are indeed curious, what are your arguments for independence in Wales?
Okay, so firstly, to the Labour members who are unsure about, whether they should, join in the independence, sort of family, you could call it, I would say to them that this is their real opportunity for change, okay? We are battling, an almost unwinnable battle where in trying to change Westminster and we're living on a hope that we are going to one day get a Labour government into Westminster that will then begin and be able to enact the changes that we need to see in, sort of throughout the UK, to make our lives better. And I think that we need to start here. We need to focus on Wales. I've digressed a little bit. Now, what I wanted to say was really that when you talk to people, ordinary people, they don't feel that things are getting better. They feel that things are getting worse. The way that, sort of we're living our lives at the moment. They've lost hope and they feel very alienated from the political system. And we need to show people that we can offer a real alternative through our politics. And I think that for Labour in Wales, it is such a battle to be able to do that because we are governing in the Senedd through our through devolution. It's government on a leash, and Labour are in a way managing austerity in Wales. Not in a way, they are, and in the councils, and people are losing faith in Labour as well. And for me, independence would be bringing about so many opportunities, but I think we need to reshape our economy. The economy of Wales is built on an extractive and exploitative model. It doesn't work for people and it doesn't work for the environment. It takes all the money, draws all the money to London, and we get a portion back we're allowed to spend. And we need to be able to have an economy in which we can invest in our country and improve our country and improve the lives of people. So, we need to have a full fiscal control, and we really do need to change the economic system. And that's why I want the Labour Party to support independence, because as the previous speaker said, the Labour Party truly has that social democratic vision, and it's about working people. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is we achieve independence and then the new state is just rigged for a new set of elites. and that ordinary people do not benefit from the new system of government. We have to ensure that the future Wales is one that works for people. And, you know, I believe that we need to create a truly egalitarian society, and that's why we need to go it alone as well. We need an elected state, sorry, not elected state, an elected head of state, an elected second chamber. And we need a society in which we can realise our humanistic ideals as socialists. So, you know, I feel that our democracy, it has been greatly undermined. Okay, and I'm rabbiting on, so I'll let somebody else speak now, because I've got loads to say on that topic, but go on.
Thank you so much. I was so responsive. Okay, Rory, what about your perspective?
Well, I think, I mean, again, I'd love to speak in more detail about Wales, but I really want to leave that up to you guys. But my perspective on Scotland, I think, is also the approach I would take to Wales, that these are countries with distinctive political cultures of their own. And those distinctive political cultures have been reinforced in some ways by having our own parliaments. But they've also been kind of contained and trapped within those parliaments. Are like devolved assemblies, whether it be in Scotland or Wales, kind of stop us from being able to express our national identity in its fullness. We become over-reliant on the political expression of national identity. So you get this stuff about clear red water in Wales. You get Nicola Sturgeon talking about different Scottish values, and we start to rely too much on these halfway house institutions to speak for us as a culture. And the bigger problem is that if you're constantly having to speak up for yourself against this much, much larger political culture to the south, you're never going to have a fully kind of mature and considered and truly self-determining political culture in Scotland without something like independence. And I think the reason I support Scottish independence is first and foremost in principle. I think I would support Scottish independence as a kind of fundamentalist. And by that, I mean, I think fundamentally independence for Scotland is a good thing. And that's kind of regardless of the political outcomes that would come from that. The question is, what do we mean by independence there? And by independence, I mean the fullest possible form of self-determination for everyone who lives here. That means a socialist Scotland. You can't have self-determination of anyone who lives here, never mind the nation, without socialism. So the question becomes not, will independence help us build socialism, but how can we pursue both socialism and independence at once alongside each other? You can't put one of these things above the other. And there's a tendency to say, to lean on the instrumental arguments for these things, like, oh, we need independence because it'll help us to make social democracy happen, because social democracy is not possible at Westminster anymore. I don't really agree with that line of argument, because I think these two things are always equal. They're always moving at the same pace within our arguments, I think. We need both independence and socialism, and we can't put one of those things above the other. So my argument for independence is really that Scotland is a distinctive political culture. And it's not going to stop being that so long as we have our own institutions, our own national institutions. So how do we make those institutions work best for socialism and work best for their own self-determination? I think that's through the struggle for independence. Now, that might be a long struggle for independence, and we'll get to that further on in the discussion, I think. But fundamentally, the principle is that self-determination is a socialist value. Socialism requires self-determination. International solidarity only works if it's on our own terms. And independence is the only way that we can assert our own terms in those networks of international solidarity that we're building. So I support independence as a fundamental principle. And the debates that I'm interested in are the ones about how you get there, when you go there, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, so I'd be interested to know again how Welsh comrades think about that. That this can be a long game, you know, but the key thing is that socialism and independence go hand in hand.
Sorry, I had to put myself off mute. I've been told I've been heavy breathing and I can only apologise. Sam, can I bring you in? Where are you, what is your opinion on the arguments for independence for Wales?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of why I think you should support independence, if you're watching this video, the first thing is I want to take a step back slightly and just say the reason why you should support having this debate. And there are some, primarily in the Conservative Party, who don't think this should be even discussed. They think it's wrong to even bring it to the table. And I'm very proud, and it's very positive to see the Labour Party continuing to be a party of policy debate and policy discussion, and I welcome that. But the first thing I really want to say is that even if you don't support Welsh independence, even if you're unsure about the idea of Welsh independence, surely you must agree that we do need a debate and a discussion on it. And it picks up very much from what Rory was saying. All of us really should believe that every citizen has the right to decide how they are governed, who they are governed by, and what their democracy looks like. And I can't understand any socialist who would not want to give the opportunity for a country to make up its own mind about who governs it and about how it is ran. And so I think even if you're unsure about independence, even if you don't think Welsh independence would work, I think all of us should be questioning and thinking, well, we must have the debate anyway. We must think about the debate, because as socialists, we have to believe in the right of self-determination. I don't know about you, but I believe the people of Wales should be allowed to have this discussion. They should be allowed to make their own decision. I trust the people of Wales to, when this issue is presented and when both sides are presented, I trust the people of Wales to make the choice for how they want to be governed. And I think it is completely undemocratic to try and shut down this debate of independence, as many in the Conservative Party often do. I think the people of Wales will make a good decision if they're given that option. But really, why I support Welsh independence is similar to what I've already said. I think what we have seen throughout COVID-19 is, and I think the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, admitted it himself, that because of devolution, lives have been saved. And I wonder if Wales was completely independent, if Wales was not shackled to Westminster financially, I wonder how many more lives could have been saved. I wonder how more radical we could have been at tackling COVID-19. And so what I've seen over the past year is Wales, a devolved administration, dealing with the COVID crisis far better than Westminster is dealing with the COVID crisis. What I have seen is a country that can make its own decisions and can do so better. A country that can lead in so many different ways. Wales is giving 16 and 17-year-olds the vote, something England still needs to catch up on. If we were independent, we would have more choice, more ability, more say on our policies. And that means that if we get a Labour government in an independent Wales, we can do more. We can be more radical. We can share more of the wealth. We can reach down and help those people who are in poverty in a bigger and greater way. And so from my perspective, why would I not want a Labour government to have more power? Why would I not want a Labour government to be able to help the people of Wales when they've been continually let down by a Westminster government? So for me, I think we all need to be open to this debate. We all need to agree that the people of Wales should have a say. But more importantly, I believe that we need to give more power to the people of Wales. Democracy is at its best when it is more localized. When politicians are more localized, there's greater accountability and there's greater democracy. And so I'm very proud that the Labour Party is the party of devolution. And I just hope now that we can go one step further and have an independent Wales, with a Labour government that is fighting for the rights of the most vulnerable in our society.
Thanks, Sam. Hugh, are you with us? I know you've been having some buffering problems.
We'll give it a go. I'll try and keep it short. I mean, there's a lot of what's been said that I might agree with. Absolutely. Maybe a couple of extra added points to make. One would be, what are the realistic hopes of seeing a Labour government back in Westminster anytime soon? In the next 10, 15, 20 years, there's got to be a fundamental question around that, I think, given the way in which politics has now developed, the way in which the Tories want to take arrangements, if you like. And there's a deeper question there as well, I think, and Rory mentioned the word culture. That's something that we need to think about and discuss, and think about whether it's possible for the communities of Wales ever really to be able to aspire to what they need and what they desire within a political culture that's so dominated by our next door neighbours in certain parts of England. So in that sense, for me, I think it's very, very difficult to see how Wales and its communities can express their political social culture within the framework of the UK. And for Labour to get back in power, it seems that we have to dilute the socialist message so much that one wonders whether that's ever going to hold any real hope for us anyway. The other added point I'd make is something that came up in discussion with a friend of mine many years ago now, an Irish friend of mine, and somewhat provocatively and amusingly, she sort of looked at or pointed towards the state of the UK, and she said, well, I'm not really sure why the Scots are making such a fuss about things, they're doing quite nicely out of the Union as compared to Wales. Now, when it comes to Wales, there really are fundamental issues and fundamental problems. And, it's very difficult to see how Wales is ever going to improve, how things are going to be materially better for us, unless Wales left the Union. And I thought that was quite an interesting and insightful sort of comment, really. And again, struck home in terms of where we are and our position within this union, and the structural long-term issues that we face in terms of trying to basically determine our own futures.
Sorry. So, just because we've all been talking individually here, if you'd all like to unmute. Having discussed it between yourselves, where are you now? What do you think the strongest argument is there?
If I can jump back in.
Go for it.
I mean, listening to my fellow panelists discuss, I think there are deep issues, aren't there, around the economy, around empowerment of our communities, and those are structural issues that are always going to remain. Even one might say, if we had a Labour government down in Westminster, and that's a point that Neville Southall himself made in one of our events with Labour for Welsh Independence. He's a big Corbyn supporter at that time, but he still said, he would go for independence anyway, particularly because of the points being made here about, well, the people who serve their communities best are those are the people who are most local to it. And it's only possible for you really to get proper empowerment as a community or as an individual if politicians are really answerable to you. And that maybe leads on to another question we might want to discuss a little later about what devolution would look like within an independent Wales, because that's got to be a fundamental part of what the social democratic Wales has got to look like.
Can I just come in on that there? For me, I do feel that independence is about bringing the people closer to democracy, and the way in which we could address that in a future Wales would be with how we structure our future polity, okay? And but I don't know if you've ever heard, she's an academic, she's called Professor Wendy Brown, and she's written a book called Undoing the Demos, okay? And what she's talking about here is how the marketization of democracy is fundamentally breaking democracy then, okay? And this is a global phenomenon. I feel that in Wales, there is still quite a strong connection between ordinary people and their democracy, because we are a small nation. And I think that if we, we become an independent small nation, we can further strengthen that democracy and ward off that undoing of the demos and try and rebuild our democracy with those classic socialist principles, how we involve ordinary people in decision making, and we spread that power out. I just wanted to mention that because I think that a lot of people are very alienated, increasingly alienated from politics, and that will only get worse at the moment. I just wanted to add that to what you said.
Thank you. Rory, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned Wendy Brown there. That book that Undoing the Demos also has a really brilliant criticism of devolution in it, where she talks about how devolution can function to just pass responsibility down for things like cuts. It can be a way of managing democracy rather than extending. Absolutely. And I think one of the key arguments for independence, certainly as far as I'm concerned, is that devolution doesn't work, and that devolution actually creates as many problems as it solves. Particularly because, you know, if it works up to a point, if it creates a lot of popularity for certain institutions, certain political parties, as we've got in Scotland, it does so partly by making sure that they don't have to deal with some of the big issues. So the SNP doesn't need to make any decisions about immigration, for instance. The SNP doesn't need to make any decisions about major levers of the economy, like monetary policy, things like this, where they would start having to take sides between, you know, labour and capital, between the many and the few. And you end up with nationalist parties able to occupy these institutions and do very little with them because they can blame Westminster for all the unpopular decisions. Now, I'm not saying that Scotland would necessarily make those decisions, but if we don't have a fight over what to do with these levers of power, then all we're doing is blaming someone else for problems that we're too afraid to deal with ourselves. Yeah. And devolution is such a vital part of, you know, the case for the union in so many ways. And I think it is possible to turn that around and say, this is a way of not taking responsibility for everything we do. And so I think that's really key. The other thing I would say that Hugh said, and just to reinforce that, is I'm not saying Scotland's a radical country, you know, and I think if there is a country in Britain that is the most likely to vote Labour every single time, it's definitely Wales, and I admire you all greatly for that. But we have our own conservatism. We have our own forms of ideology that stop us from taking on vested interests. But what happens is we get dragged into these battles, UK-wide battles, to appeal to a distinctly English kind of conservatism that we don't agree with, and you get, this is why you get Scottish conservatives voting for independence, people who are kind of small c conservatives, because even they feel alienated from the project of the UK ruling class to justify their ideas and their politics. And if you're constantly fighting someone else's battles or trapped in someone else's nightmares, then you're going to end up with a pretty twisted political consciousness at home as well. And I constantly make this point that Scottish independence is not about blaming England for everything. It's about finally getting the opportunity to blame ourselves for things and do something about our own problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not really we're great and we're going to be brilliant. It's about saying
absolutely. Yeah, it's taking responsibility, you know, and people respect that, and people have lost respect for a lot of politicians, even increasingly so in Wales, because it's a blame game. You know, politics has become a blame game, and as you said, the limits of devolution, it fuels that blame game. You have Labour in Wales saying, well, you know, it's not our fault. You know, we're austerity, and we've only got so many powers, and then we've got Westminster saying, but you've got Labour in charge there. It's a blame game. People do not respect this. You know, I'm with the ordinary people on that.
I feel, sorry, I know I'm not a panelist, but I do feel the response to the pandemic has shown that Wales very much is able to govern without needing that blame game. And I think the Welsh government's done that very well. I think just based on what you said, Rory, there, let's bring forward a question. And it's one that you're all expecting me to ask you, is how do we do this? How do we avoid this conversation and the route to independence, or at least the route to asking the question of independence? How do we avoid that becoming an argument of toxic nationalism versus self-determination? Anybody want to pitch in first?
Yeah, I'll pitch in first. Engagement is the first step. You know, it's conversation. It's conversation with ordinary people. But as we are talking here as Labour for Indie Wales, okay, I want to say, before we start talking about how we need to go out into the communities and we talk to ordinary people, and I want to say...
Not allowed to knock doors right now.
No, I mean, on the internet. But we need to have this conversation with our politicians, I feel, because they're in danger themselves of turning it into a toxic debate. I was very disappointed just last week, or it was on the weekend, when Nia Griffith, she came out with saying that nationalists were indulging in fantasies with regard to independence. Now,
it is an argument we're going to get, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
we've got a really broad Labour Party. We've got a broad spectrum of voters outside of the Labour Party.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to have people with that view. I mean, there are a lot of people from the original sort of previous votes that were really, really on that. We can't do it. We don't need it. And we're going to have that conversation with those people, because we need to persuade them.
We are, but it's what I'm trying to say is it's the words that we use are key, okay? Because you see, a lot of people are moving over to independence increasingly. But what Labour is in danger of is that those people will move away from Labour if our leaders, our politicians who are out there, do not engage properly on the debate. And that was something I wanted to mention about, you know, sort of toxic nationalism, because it's how we frame this debate and the language that we use is so important. And within Labour, it is very hard to... All of us have probably had to have conversations with other Labour members and say, I support independence, and we have come up against it. And we want to have the debate in a positive way, and I want our MPs and I want our MSs and our councillors to also understand that a lot of the electorate are now opening their minds to this. And if they just come back at them and say, you're indulging in fantasies or other such negative language, it will repel those voters. Okay. And that does play a part in it. Now, how we can engage with them in that conversation, but I think it's important that we have to stop and think about the language that we use as well. And you know, I feel that I'm a member of Yes Cymru, and I feel that the language that is used there and amongst those forums, you know, of civic nationalism is very positive, it's inclusive, it's embracing, it's safe, and we're used to coming up against that toxic nationalism, but from the unionists then sometimes, not all unionists, but some. But then it does come as a bit of a shock sometimes when it comes from the left. And that's what I just wanted to say. We have to be careful of that on the left, that we don't alienate others on the left. Go on.
I'm going to bring in Hugh now because he's dying to get in, or at least he's got his hand up.
I got my hand up, yeah. So, I mean, I assume some of this is to do with our attitude towards the rest of the world, presumably, and the idea that, you know, nationalism is necessarily inward-looking, and it would take us down a path towards this toxicity that we're referring to.
I think as well, it's that piece of the toxicity of some of the union nationalism as well against sort of independence.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's a very obvious argument as to why independence is actually a route out of toxicity, and you just have to look at the recent history of the UK and the politics that's, you know, we've been embroiled in since about 2012, 2013, ever since Farage and his goons got a grip of the London press. And so, you know, there's no sort of great proof, I don't think, needed that actually independence for Wales can lift us out of that sort of type of turbocharged nationalism. And, you know, to return to the issue or the question of culture, look at our traditions, look at the thinkers, the ideas that have always animated our attitude towards the rest of the world. You know, Richard Price, one of the greatest philosophers who spoke during the French Revolution, look at what he said about what it means to love your country. It's not about loving your country above and beyond others. It's not about taking a sort of chauvinist view of the world. You can love your country whilst at the same time, you know, pay heed to and respect the rights of others across the world. And that's deeply embedded, not just in our sort of more left-wing socialist tradition or radical tradition. It's part and parcel as well of the Welsh nationalist culture of figures like Gwynfor Evans and other people who've, you know, been part of Plaid Cymru. And so, you know, I just think it's a fallacy and it's a ridiculous sort of discussion that people try and sort of, involve us with, because for me, you know, you look at Cardiff as the capital city, one of the finest buildings that we have is the Temple of Peace that was established in 1938 by David Davies, you know, a big Welsh radical who kind of embodied really the Welsh radical tradition from the 19th century into the early 20th century. That's what we're about as a people. It's what the Labour Party always talks about. So I just find this whole sort of notion that Welsh nationalism would take us down this sort of route. Yeah, it's a fallacy for me.
Thanks. Rory, you got your hand up. What's your experience over there? Oh, sorry, up there in Scotland.
Over there is also fine.
Over by there, I think, is the actual official phrase.
Okay. I think it's a great question. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head by talking about self-determination. That's the goal here, and it's really important not to try and think of independence as a political campaign that's going to end up with a yes/no vote, and then to build all your arguments and your policy platform on top of that. The goal is not to win a referendum. The goal is to achieve actual meaningful radical independence. And in doing so, you have to avoid making arguments for the sake of winning them. And to an extent, I think Wales is in a better position than Scotland here, because you're further down, you're earlier on in the road to having that big political conflict with the state that we're currently potentially about to enter, where everyone is a kind of partisan now, and everyone is just making arguments based on which side they already agree with and so on. And no one's really trying to conduct arguments about, whether independence will work economically and so on. And when you talk about, accusations from unionists who say you're indulging fantasies, the best way of responding to that is by not indulging fantasies. And there's a huge amount of fantasy around independence in Scotland. People who think independence will genuinely give us like runaway GDP growth. It's actually going to be quite difficult, economically speaking, I think. And understanding the actual challenges that we face in making this stuff work for everyone who lives here, or for the vast majority of people who live here, is a really vital part of the struggle for independence, because it's not just the struggle for the formal status of independent statehood, at least not if we're socialist. It's a struggle for meaningful collective self-determination. And that means trying to get to a position where Scotland can make the decision to become independent on the best possible terms for socialism. If that means extending our strategic horizons into a longer time frame, then so be it. If that means building alliances that we're uncomfortable with, then so be it. if it means continuing to work through the British state as much as we can to develop our economies to the point where they're more resilient for independence, then that's an essential part of the struggle for independence. And so avoiding this temptation to be dragged into holding positions for the sake of being able to say independence will be fine is really important. It's too late for us, really. We're kind of stuck in electoral politics mode now. And maybe, you know, if the SNP trip over their shoelaces at the next election and things are set back by 10 years, there might be chance for a reset. But as it stands, we're looking at a form of independence which is not particularly radical at all. It'll still be worthwhile in the long run, but it's going to be considerably harder to get things like the Labour Party, the Labour movement on board with that vision of independence we've got now than it is for you guys, where you can set out a longer time frame for these things and say, look, we're not talking about independence tomorrow necessarily. If you don't think that's feasible, let's get together and go, how do we make self-determination feasible economically? How can we all work together on these things? So trying to build those kinds of alliances and coalitions, I think, is really vital, and you're in a really good position to start doing it.
Sam's got some opinions on this, and I can see starting to get in.
Yeah, I think we need to be very careful that we should not become a party or a movement that wants independence for the sake of independence. I think we should want independence because when we achieve independence, it can be an extension of our rights. And I think we need to focus on the vision and the reason why we want independence and the story and the narrative and the future which we're fighting for. I think that's the way that we deal with some of these incorrect and toxic assertions, is to challenge them with the reality, to bring people along with the view and the vision that we have for Wales, to tell them and to explain to them what we can achieve as an independent country. And so it's not independence for the sake of independence or for isolationism, but it's independence to extend rights to all, to empower the needy. Those who have been left behind and forgotten by Westminster, who's going to go after them? Who's going to defend them? Who's going to stand up for them? It's clearly not Westminster. They've had, well, hundreds of years to try and address that. And I think that that's what an independent Wales can do. I think independence should be for socialism, for equality. Independence should be for a fairer society. It should be a way to extend democracy. It should be a way to bring down poverty. It should be a way to eradicate child poverty. These are the things we're trying to do. It should be a way that we can extend the cooperative economy. And I think when we sell the vision to people about what we're trying to do, and then we point back to how Welsh Labour governments have been restricted in what they can do by Westminster. I think all of these reasons I've labelled, trying to get rid of poverty, trying to extend democracy, these are reasons why I'm in the Labour Party. And I think they're also the same reasons why I want independence. And I think that's really important. The reasons why I support independence are the same reasons I'm part of the Labour Party. And I'll just say that I firmly believe that the road to socialism in Wales, starts within Welsh independence. And the road to independence, I think, ends with socialism. For that is our goal. Our goal is a radically different society. Our goal is not just to get independence because, well, we don't like the English. It's nothing like that. The reason why we want independence is because we believe it is the best way to help those people who have been forgotten about, who have been trampled on by successive Conservative governments in Westminster. Who is going to stand up for these people? How are we going to best protect the most vulnerable in Wales? And I think that's with a Welsh government, a Welsh Labour government, that can make its own decisions on all of its policies, not just a few. And so I think it's about selling that narrative and that story. Let's bring people along with us. This is our vision for an independent Wales. And it is a society that protects the most needy and vulnerable. Because I can't say that about the Westminster government. I can't say that about Boris Johnson. But the future, an independent Wales, a Labour government, unrestricted by the Conservatives, I can see that being a tangible future. And that's the future that I want for my children. and for my grandchildren as well.
Thank you. Okay, Madhu.
Okay, just one last thing. I wanted to say that we need to feel comfortable talking about national identity and talking about nationalism itself. There is sometimes socialists, fear that topic of nationalism and all the historical connotations that go with it. And it's not antithetical to socialist aims, and nationalism for Wales, it can work with our internationalist aims and ideals. Okay, we can be better internationalists actually if we achieve independence, but we do have to feel comfortable talking about national identity and not be scared about it, because the right, and especially the far right, are very comfortable talking about it with people, but they talk about it in a more negative, inward-looking way. And what we have to do is have those conversations in a positive, outward-looking way. And I think a lot of people, somebody mentioned just now about how, the whole Brexit experience we've gone through has had an element of toxic nationalism with it, with regard to UK nationalism, okay? And, this is another debate, but within the same umbrella, so to speak. And in Wales, people feel very much that they are that independence embraces their national identity. And what we have now from UK Labour is a strong push with regard to the unionism and the flag waving that we're seeing from politicians on a national level. And that can be very off-putting for Welsh people and for Welsh Labour members, because they kind of think, well, I'm a Welsh Labour member. Where does Labour stand on this for me? And I think we have to be clear as Welsh Labour where we stand on that, and we have to be very open to have those conversations with people on their terms. And Rory said about the comment that I made about the person, the unionist, who said about indulging in fantasies. No, unfortunately, Rory, this was a Welsh Labour politician very recently. I do apologise, because I know this is a Labour podcast, but it's imperative that we say it, because I feel the tone and language needs to be improved in this area. That's all. Thank you.
So we're at the hour now, but we were late starting. So I'm going to roll in the next two questions together if we can go through them. So we've had last week soft launch, Mark Drakeford, First Minister, talking about Home Rule for Wales and looking at it as internationalism rather than inward-looking nationalism, which I think we've covered a lot of over the last 10 minutes. So what's your opinions?
And then I'll go quickly. I felt that I very much understand Mark Drakeford's position, especially his federalism, but I felt that the words home rule were the incorrect choice of words, because for me it immediately brought up the memory, the discussions of sort of Irish independence. When Ireland was fighting for home rule, okay, and we are in a very different, we're in a different time, and the debate with regard to independence has already been framed. The language is, home rule is not the language that is being used, okay. Now I felt that by choosing to say home rule was potentially vague and misleading for voters, because a lot of voters out there might think, oh, right, okay, so Labour, they're for home rule. This means that they're for independence. Well, actually, no, the vision for Welsh Labour is a federalist one. And, the union would still be an overarching power in that vision. So I wasn't completely comfortable with that particular choice of words, that's all.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
I understand that one reason potentially that language was used was because it was felt that home rule somehow provided a more sort of permanent sort of hue, as it were, to devolution, and that the First Minister felt that that was more representative of where we are. And one can understand that, really, given the situation and some of the debate around the Senedd, and obviously the presence of abolish, the Assembly and so forth. But yeah, I'd agree that maybe that language is not necessarily indicative, really, of that sort of idea. And actually, if we're going to be thinking in terms of another, as it were, constitutional development that would provide that sort of certainty and would ensure that we can't, as it were, turn the clock back, then you'd return to the idea of dominion status. And I mentioned Alastair Morgan earlier on. I mean, this is one of the ideas that he's discussed previously, partly, I think, because of his view that in some ways it's better to try and get what you can, as it were, almost through the back door, and that the concept of dominion is actually something that's very flexible. It was used in very different ways with different countries, obviously, back in the 20s and 30s. And the point also that he made on that was that if you look at what Scotland was aiming for with a referendum in 2014 by maintaining the monarch, then in effect one wouldn't have been able to describe that as dominion status. And so I think there's something to be said for at least having a debate around that concept, because if you're talking about a movement that's going to bring people together, that's not going to divide, as it were, and you want to take the referendum route, then maybe that's one way of doing it, in such a way that you hedge your bets and that you maintain a sort of movement that has many different views, including, of course, those who are monarchists. So that's just one reflection. Personally, of course, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with that view on things. And I'm not really in the game of trying to sort of look ahead too far. But I think, what Rory was saying about the nature of all this and the sort of deeper meanings and deeper sort of long-term changes that somebody's looking for, then, the sort of electoral politics of referendum is not necessarily always helpful in that regard. So if we were to necessarily go down that route and say that's what we want to aim for, as quickly as possible, I think we need to be really realistic about the chances. And I think maybe look at that as an opportunity to emulate Scotland in some ways, because what was striking about Scotland in 2014 was the way in which the referendum itself created a huge sort of groundswell in interest in politics. It really, created excitement and interest. And more than anything, what we need really in Wales is, the development of a public sphere here. We're seeing the makings of that with, events like this, and also, in terms of the alternative media, we've got developments that are really, really exciting, I think, and there's a lot of potential to them. I think really, if a referendum in the next few years, especially if we don't see, Scotland going independent, the best we can hope for is a sort of national conversation that's going to move us on again. So, there are questions that need to be thought about in terms of the idea of a referendum. Ideally, for me, what we need to try and do is conduct that national conversation in the sort of way Rory was suggesting, and that it is perhaps a slow burn, because I think eventually, if we do get into communities, as it were, and I'm talking about the movement as a whole, we do have those conversations. I think in terms of the potential and the amount of communities and people who would get on board if they were persuaded and, given enough confidence, I think that, potentially you could have a really strong majority in favour of independence eventually, but that might be somewhere down the line after we've been able to build these alternative structures, if you like, and really build that public sphere.
We are running short on time, so I'm going to go Sam and then Rory. And thank you, Hugh. Sorry to cut you off there. Sam.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I'll be very very brief. Maybe it's just because I'm quite young and naive, but I think home rule is not the most precise language that could have been used, and I can see how that can cause problems. But I just want to say that as Labour for an Independent Wales, I think we need to support every call for devolution and every call for further powers to Wales. And I think we do need to, in some respects, say thank you and well done to Mark Drakeford for saying that Wales needs more powers. I think the phrase Mark said in his statement was that we need a more powerful devolution settlement. And
I really saw it as more of an olive branch.
Yes, yeah, and I think we need to say thank you, and we need to say this is right, and we do need to say that Wales does need further devolution, and as Labour for an Independent Wales, we agree with that. We will happily have more powers to Wales. The difference is, I think we would want more powers to Wales, and I think that the devil will be in the detail, as it was. But I think, as a whole, it shows how Welsh Labour, the debate is moving, and the debate is becoming more positive. That you've got a First Minister actively calling out for more powers to Wales. That's absolutely what the First Minister of Wales should be doing. However, I do think we need to go further, and I think that Labour for an Independent Wales, by organising members and by campaigning for this, will eventually have it. But I do think that times are changing in Welsh Labour, and I do think Mark is a lot more favourable than other MSs could be.
Thank you. Rory, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's part of the nature of the British state. Part of the problem is that it's very difficult to make any headway with things like independence without some allies down south. And we're seeing this now. You know, a UK government can just keep blocking a referendum in Scotland. Now, there's lots of ways we can put pressure on them up here, but ultimately, if the English electorate is going to keep returning governments that are 100% against a referendum, then it's going to be very difficult for us to get anywhere. What I mean is, we need allies, and we can make alliances with the left in England. And one of the ways that we do that is by not just settling for our respective national leaderships demanding home rule, but using the independence movements, using that pressure to reform the British state as a whole for people down south as well. I don't just mean have an English Parliament. I mean, the thing that, you know, the basis of a lot of our critique of the British state, I think, is that it seems very difficult to reform and almost impossible to reform. But, you know, if we don't get independence, it's worth keeping that iron in the fire at the same time. And I think using, you know, the few times that the British state has reformed itself a bit has been in response to nationalism, and understanding that independence movements can also play a role as a kind of battering ram for the reform of the whole British state towards something more republican, towards something that has a written constitution, not just devolution, but actual shared sovereignty across various regional and national units. Independence movements can be an extremely valuable way of doing that, and understanding the kind of blackmail potential that independence movements have in forcing the British state to reform itself is a key part of what I suppose are the kind of subtleties of pro-independence strategy. Don't just go, what we need is either more devolution or independence. There's also a third option, more devolution or independence. Or if we say that more devolution is not good enough, devolution is fundamentally flawed, we want either more independence or a fundamental structural reform of the British state, so that we can't be bought off with promises of more powers, a bit more power, but say either you change things at the centre or we get independence. And I think that's where we can shift the debate now from both Wales and Scotland and get away from this kind of get out middle ground of more devolution.
Thank you. That's really good. Okay, I'm going to go around you all quickly. Sam, first off the mark. How and when for independence? What's the route? When should it happen?
Well, for me, I think I see Welsh Labour as being fundamental in the campaign for independence. Labour is the party that achieves most of the votes at elections, and the socialist ideology of Labour is inherently compatible with Welsh independence. I don't believe that Welsh independence will be achieved by a top-down approach. So I don't think we should be relying on MPs or MSs or councillors, and I say that as a councillor. I think Welsh independence will be won when individuals, when the rank and file, when individual trade unionists come together, organise themselves, and just show that they want a new way of doing things in Wales. And so I think in terms of the how, I think it has to be done from ordinary people in Wales standing up and saying, we want Welsh independence, but not just Welsh independence, we want a socialist Wales, which only a Labour Party can deliver. And then in terms of when, I'd settle for as soon as possible. That's
Sounds good to me. Thanks, Sam. Madhu.
I agreed with Sam there. I think it should be a bottom-up approach. Something that is by the people, for the people. This is something that's going to succeed. An elitist top-down sort of solution will not. People need to own this. What needs to happen now is it's preparation, isn't it? It's, we're not just in a sort of like a campaign for independence phase. We have to start preparing. We have to start preparing for post-independence as though it is a dead cert that independence is going to happen, because in the preparation we will develop our answers that people ask, to the questions that people ask us. When it should happen, I feel that it's absolutely essential that Wales achieves independence at the same time that Scotland achieves independence and that Ireland is reunited. I think that if we are left alone in the union with England, we are just going to become subsumed into the into England. Basically, our voice in Parliament has already diminished from 40 MPs to 32, and I think it's absolutely essential that we take this moment now at the same time as the other devolved nations. If we don't now, we may never get this opportunity again.
Thank you. Rory, thoughts from the outside?
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic point about how ideally we would all become independent at once, because A, that would be an incredibly powerful international message about the collapse of the British state. And I think the key thing I would say about how is also when, is that avoiding this sense that we're all holding our breath until the big moment when we're suddenly independent and we've crossed the finish line. That's becoming harder and harder to sustain as we see how powerful the British state is in blocking that big moment. If it looks like it's likely to happen, they can just say, no, this isn't going to happen. And they can use that power to make sure that whatever independence we do get through simply a referendum will be carefully constrained. And you will end up with some kind of compromise with a nationalist government in Edinburgh or in Wales and a London government. The alternative to that is to act as if we're already independent, to push at every single level of culture, institutions, political movements, to make sure that we're building up capacity for independence as much as possible through projects like community wealth building that's happening in North Ayrshire or Preston, and building up resilience in communities that makes the question of whether or not we can survive it economically irrelevant, for instance. At the same time, undermining and hollowing out the legitimacy of the British state in these situations. So making sure that by the time it comes to that final push when we can declare independence, there's almost no resistance at all. That no one even thinks about the British state as a significant player in the country anymore. And trying to build up that capacity is a long game. It's about working through the trade unions, through civil society, through local government, community groups, etc., not to get them to support a yes vote when a referendum eventually comes, but to act as if they're already, first and foremost, Welsh political movements or Scottish political movements, that their objective is already building up Wales and Scotland's capacity to act independently in a self-determining fashion. And I think that can be a long game, because the power of it comes from that process. At the same time, we have to recognize that there will be a kind of eventual struggle with the state. But in building up that capacity, you already give yourself the ability to have that struggle. So I think it's not so much the when, and gradualism is fine, I think, in that sense, but how is the really crucial thing.
Thank you. You, internal academic view.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Rory how much of that was inspired by Gramsci and his Bora position, but we can go into that.
Maybe need a different podcast for that.
Yeah, but I think, you know, yeah, Rory's speaking a lot of sense there, and I think that's a particular challenge for us in Wales, and I think there I would actually lay a challenge at the door of the Labour Party, you know, because I think we can say, without being, you know, too overly critical here, that actually engagement with our communities as a party has not been what it should be. Certainly that's what I feel in Cardiff, and I'm sure that people feel that across our communities. And, you know, it would do a lot of good for the party to actually get involved in the sort of projects that Rory's talking about, just for the sake of the party itself, let alone the question of independence. Especially if you consider the traditions that we have in terms of community projects and so forth. But anyway, I feel as it were the anxiety that people are expressing about having to take this opportunity. But being realistic, I do wonder whether that will happen for us, because we are behind the curve a little. And so, again, I think that just means that we need to emphasize all those aspects of engaging communities, especially the disaffected, because it might not happen that way. But if we have that groundwork in place, then I'm pretty sure that, if Scotland left, we would follow fairly swiftly afterwards. And especially, I think that would be the final kick up the behind for some people in the Labour Party, if Scotland did leave. So, the last thing I would probably say is, as well as the hard work, the hard graft, we need some inspiration. We need the ideas, and we need to tell people what this alternative Wales is going to look like. It's not necessarily going to be the land of milk and honey. We're not all going to be millionaires. We might even be a little poorer materially, who knows? But I think it could definitely be a Wales where we would be much richer in terms of our values, the ways in which we can organise our communities, and perhaps that's the most important thing. So we need that vision, I think, that inspiration, and that's work for the Yes movement as a whole. In terms of when, well, Wales was annexed in 1536 by Henry Tudor. 500 years later, maybe that's the time for us to finally extract ourselves and start again.
Do it on the anniversary.